Hello, you're watching ThePrint.in and I'm Nikhil Rampal. And in this special broadcast, we are going to talk about which countries have a strong influence over Asia. Earlier this month, the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, released its annual Asia Power Index report 2023. In that report, it mentioned that India ranked number 4 in overall influence over the region after the US, China, and Japan. But the score difference at India's rank with those of the superpowers is just too wide. Its recent surge in population brings us to ask many questions around its influence and power in the region. Is India improving? Is India headed towards the right direction? What would it take for us to gain influence and powers in Asia? To answer all these questions, today we have Miss Susannah Patton, Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Lowy Institute. Welcome to ThePrint, Susannah.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So, Susannah, let's begin this question answer round. My first question to you is, your report mentions that in 2018, India was a major power in Asia since it scored above 40 in the index. And now it's a middle power due to its falling scores. What are the biggest factors influencing India's power in the region?
So I think the most important thing to understand about the power index is that power is relative. So that means that even if India were improving, for example, its military capability in absolute terms, like that is to say you are adding more tanks, more surface vessels, more military assets. If others are improving their capability faster, then India's score will still decline. And so that's what we've seen over the past 5 years, really, of the Asia Power Index, is that in India's case, the gap between India on the one hand and the US and China on the other hand has grown.
And what do you think are the biggest factors? We see 8 factors broad indicators that you put down. Which are the factors you think you see the gap widening the fastest?
So I think there are a few areas, as you say, we have 8 measures in the power index. One area I think that India suffered quite significant losses is the measure that we call resilience. So India had the 3rd biggest decline in resilience in our current edition of the Power Index. And throughout the period of the pandemic, India had considerable losses, and that reflects the fact that India suffered quite a big impact in terms of its economic resilience, for example, its ability to withstand external shocks.
Could you elaborate a little more on what resilience is, how resilience is measured, just for our audience?
Sure. So we measure resilience in a few different areas. It includes political resilience, so thinking about like political stability, geoeconomic resilience, and that's one area where we have seen India's scores decline. And then we also, for some countries where it's relevant, we also include the nuclear deterrent as an aspect of resilience, meaning that that country has the capacity to withstand external pressure. So the pandemic did have an impact, especially on India's economic resilience. Another measure where India's relative score has declined is the area of cultural influence. For that measure, we look at the level of interest across countries in Asia in things like radio and TV broadcasters from each country. And we've seen those scores go down for India. And then the final area where I would say India is probably lagging is that of defense networks. So we look at defense networks, that is to say the number of dialogues, combined exercises, and this kind of thing that countries in the region have with each other. And even though India, of course, has been expanding military cooperation with other countries, it's not happening quite as fast as it is in some other cases. Like if we look at the rapid expansion of US, Japan, Australia, trilateral military defense networks. So those are a few areas where India's performance has meant that its overall power score has lagged, as you say.
All right. Now, then this brings us to the next question. Though India has consistently maintained its fourth rank in this index, yet its scores are almost halfway marked from being a superpower. How long do you think should it take India to ameliorate its influence or to gain or become superpower in the region?
That's a very hard question because the trend that we have seen is not necessarily that India's score is increasing, as you say. In some
Hmm.
ways, it's actually the case that the gap between both India and Japan on the one hand, and the United States and China on the other hand, is growing. So, on its current trajectory, we would not really expect India necessarily to ever establish itself as a superpower within the terms of the Asia Power Index.
Not anytime soon, you mean?
It's hard to imagine that that would happen anytime soon, given that the gap is so great.
Hmm. So I'm looking at these eight broad parameters. Whose graphics are running on the screen. India's diplomatic influence in the region is high. It scored above 65, if I'm not wrong. And despite that, its economic relationships are quite weak. What's happening here? Are good diplomatic ties not translating into financial gains?
Yeah, I think you're right to say there is a big difference for India from the diplomatic influence where India scores pretty well to economic relationships where India scores quite poorly.
Hmm.
So there are a few reasons for that. One, I think, is just the structure of India's economy. India is not as integrated into supply chains with the countries of East Asia as other economies that we include in the index are.
Mhm.
India's focus tends to be more on internal demand rather than export-led growth, and so that has an impact on India's economic relationships with the rest of Asia. I guess added to that is the fact that India is also not a part of the major regional trade groups like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Which we include in the index under our economic diplomacy category.
Hmm.
Compared with some other countries in the index, India is also not giving as much by way of aid or development assistance as other countries. So all of that are things that we consider to be beneficial for a country's economic relationships, and India doesn't do particularly well in any of them. I think the other point that's important to make about India's economic relationships is that India's influence tends to be quite concentrated in South Asia, which is of course to be expected that that India's influence would primarily be in neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. But of course the power index is much broader, and so there we're talking about measuring India's relationships with countries like Indonesia or Vietnam as well.
Mhm. And the report also mentions that the lack of foreign trade agreements, both local and international, is somehow influencing this particular parameter as well. Could you elaborate a little more on it, like why India doesn't go in the FTAs that often that relative to other countries?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I guess it also depends on, certain value judgments about what the importance of these agreements might be. Because some of the feedback that I've seen to the Asia Power Index from commentators in India has said, for example, that actually India is stronger because it's not a part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership along with China as well. So I guess that's a different perspective on this question.
Mm-hmm.
But according to the way that the index is structured, it is considered to be a positive to be a part of regional trade and economic arrangements.
So having foreign trade agreements or aligning with the world in terms of trade does help in index, but may not be seen or may not be perceived to be as powerful I think this is what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I guess if you think about the index, perhaps not so much thinking about India just for a minute, but say if we think about US-China competition, many analysts would agree that China has an advantage over the US because China is part of big trade agreements with countries in Asia, whereas the US has been quite reluctant. And so that's why we allocate certain points to countries that are active in negotiating free trade agreements. And of course, as we've already discussed, India is not one of those countries that really seeks these agreements out under its current economic policy.
Now, this also brings us to another question that you mentioned that the economic relationships in India have been weakening ever since this report was started in 2018. Why do you think this has been deteriorating?
So part of this is just to do with relative advantage. So the fact that China is becoming a more and more important trade and investment partner for countries in Asia, and it has almost a perfect score when it comes to economic relationships. But there are also specific cases that we can track in terms of India's influence in neighbouring countries, where India has become a less important trade and investment partner. So we've seen that trend in countries like Sri Lanka, where China has become a more important investor. I think also to a lesser extent in Bangladesh and Nepal. And so that is having an impact on India's score in this measure.
Okay. So let's also come to the next question. The report talks about a power gap. Could you explain or elaborate a bit on what this power gap is?
Sure. So the report includes a concept called the power gap, which refers to the discrepancy between the influence we would expect a country to have based on their resources and their actual influence. So, for example, some countries like Japan that are highly networked and that are active across the full range of influence measures from diplomatic to cultural to defence score extremely well on the power gap. So Japan has the biggest positive power gap of any country in the region. Whereas on the other hand, you have countries that are not fully invested in building their influence across the range of measures, countries like North Korea or Russia, who have the largest negative power gaps. So what that indicator can tell us really is whether a country is getting bang for its buck, whether the resources that a country brings to bear are actually translating into influence. Or another way of looking at it is what you have and what you do with what you have.
So why is India's power gap deteriorating? Why is it waning into a negative territory?
So India's power gap has deteriorated over the course of the 5 editions of the Power Index. It did actually improve slightly in the most recent edition. But overall, India has a substantial negative power gap. And that really reflects some of the things that we've already been talking about. So the fact that India's economic relationships are relatively strong, its cultural influence, according to some of our measures, has declined. But also potentially the fact that, as I said, the defence networks are not moving as fast as they are for some other countries in the region. And so all of that contributes to a picture where India's resources is not necessarily translating into increased influence.
So basically, India has the potential somehow, but it's not utilizing it to its full extent. Does that what the power gap mean?
I think that's a good conclusion to draw. I think the power gap that India records tells us that India has high potential to become more influential in future. But on the other hand, we have to look at it and say, well, if India has not managed to decrease that power gap over the last 5 consecutive years that we've been publishing this report, then will that change in future?
Okay, now this brings us to the concluding question, just one or two of them. So according to the United Nations population prospects, India is estimated to cross China's population this year. Is a larger population no longer at the center of being powerful? How does population play a role in being an influence?
So population is important in a couple of ways. Population, especially when there's a demographic dividend that's still to come, can be a good sign about a country's untapped economic potential. And so it's definitely true to say that, for example, China faces very unfavorable demographics with no demographic dividend, out to 2050. And so that will be a drag, for example, on China's influence. But it's not necessarily the case that population alone makes a country powerful. So to give you another example, consider Japan and the Philippines. Japan has a population that's roughly similar to the Philippines, just a little bit larger. But Japan is the third most powerful country in the index, and the Philippines is number 16. So a big population also means that you have big costs to pay in terms of the resources which it takes to look after that big population. A country like Singapore has a tiny population but can focus externally to a high degree because it doesn't have to do so much in terms of healthcare, education, feeding its population. And so I think population alone is not the key determinant of power.
Anymore, like it was in the past. India is also the host for G20 this year. Do you think that this is an opportunity for the country to improve its influence in the region?
I would certainly expect that India's hosting of the G20 would mean that its diplomatic influence would increase in our index in the next year. Of course, depending on how India performs in that role. We've seen that other recent hosts of big regional summit meetings, including Indonesia, have got a bump in their influence after they've hosted these meetings. And the meetings, of course, are also an opportunity for diplomatic activity that is, in the sidelines or in the margins of the meeting. So it means that a lot of world leaders will be traveling to India. How India uses and leverages those opportunities for bilateral diplomacy as well is something that will have a bearing on its diplomatic influence in the next edition of the Power Index.
Well, I think that brings us towards the end of this interview. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Susannah. The Asia Power Index does offer great insights on the gaps that India needs to fill if it aims to be a superpower, at least in Asia. Do read the detailed analysis of the Lowy Institute in the description box given below, and we'll catch up with you later. We'll be back with a new broadcast on more such issues soon. Stay tuned to ThePrint.in.